thank you. Thanks to the Urban Democracy Lab and to these fantastic panelists for these papers. I come at this from Labor Studies Institute, and as Kafui mentioned at the beginning, there's a big push inside of the labor movement in the United States today to be thinking about infrastructure as a main site for activism. One, because of the excellent green jobs that such infrastructures allow here in the United States context. If we were to invest enormous amounts of money inside of the infrastructures in the United States, we would have, we would stop wasting as much water as we waste, we would use less energy, et cetera. And because these are largely public sector jobs that are well paid and unionized, it would be a great way to maintain living standards for workers in the US. So that's my kind of take on infrastructure. And when I was invited to moderate this panel, I was really amazed and excited by all the things that I read and heard today. The arguments that we heard here ask us to be thinking about infrastructure at a deeper and more nuanced way. They are making visible a social phenomenon that, as many of them pointed to inside of their own talks, is often just thought of as background that we don't really think about. And in fact, the invisibility of infrastructure, I think, and I'd love for the panelists to think about this as they already have, but perhaps speak about it out loud, the invisibility of infrastructure often kind of serves the status quo of the powers that the infrastructures are governed through and by. And it's making the infrastructure visible and the way that it works, the power relations that these infrastructures embody, the grim stories sometimes of exploitation, of despoilment, of environmental destruction that these infrastructures both prevent, but in some cases, like Melanie's position, open up. Making these visible, and then also making visible the ways in which infrastructure opens up sites for resistance, opens up sites for contestation, for negotiation, and for struggle, and for visionary new ways of thinking about how society can be built from the ground up. These papers made me have a much kind of broader way of thinking about infrastructure in the way that I have, compared to the way that I've typically thought about it. So I want to thank you all for that. And I will have some questions as we go along, but I'm hoping that we can hear from all of you, and you can ask your questions as well. Stuart, yeah.
Hi. Okay. So I guess my question is for anybody. Based on the past couple of weeks of protests that have been happening around the city and around the country that have been targeting infrastructure in sort of kind of, to me, really original and unique ways. I mean, there's precedents for them, but, people have been in this city going onto highways, going onto bridges, blocking them. Just this morning, the Staten Island Expressway was closed, which has probably never been closed by a protest before. So these are all, I think, really amazing protests that are sort of getting at the sort of making visible the invisible, like Penny just said, getting at the symbolic value that highways have in this country as sort of, they're conduits for the military-industrial complex. Originally, they're also forces of racial segregation. So I think that the protests are really appropriate. But it seems like in what all of you are talking about, the protests around infrastructure are sort of more directly targeted by people who have a labor connection to them, to the bits of infrastructure. Well, maybe not everybody's talk, but I wonder if you have thoughts about these protests that we're seeing right now, where the people who are doing them are just sort of seizing an opportunity that just kind of is in front of them, and they don't necessarily have any sort of direct or organic connection to the infrastructure itself. It's not like a typical labor protest, even like a port shutdown or something, which I think might be a precedent for some of what we're seeing. But it's kind of a different character in that way because it's just anybody can do it really, and that's what's happening. That's what we're seeing. So that's my question.
And we can take a couple of questions at once, and the panelists can come back. So the others can.
This is for Rosalind. So just building on this, I was thinking of the 1968 Memphis sanitation strike in terms of thinking about the garbage workers that you were studying. And I was just curious, it seems like the infrastructure is so affected by neoliberalism, but I was curious, there's so much in common across those sort of garbage strike. The Memphis strike was started by, 2 workers were crushed in a truck that malfunctioned. And, it seemed like a lot of the sorts of moral claims and claims to like human rights and, race and class and things like that were in common across those cases.
Well, I can just quickly respond to that, maybe, while people ruminate. No, I mean, I think that's absolutely correct. I think there's a lot of resonances across, many different sort of historical time periods and kind of geographical spaces. And I do think there's something, I haven't done a sort of explicit comparison of the two, but I do think there's a lot to be compared there about the sort of politics of manifestation, which I think is what we're getting at here, which is both about sort of rendering visible, rendering legible that which is, taken for granted, seen as background, seen as sort of material scaffolding, but not as body, as, community, as aspiration, as desire, all of that. Between those two examples, absolutely. And I do think that connects quite a bit with this previous comment about sort of why the sort of, where these protests take place, where these acts of manifestation take place, and sort of why that enters a certain sort of public sphere. And I do think that it's not an accident that sort of politics of manifestation in these different forms takes place sort of in the very hard, architectures, very hard sort of scaffolding that is seen as the kind of persistent, product of the state, for, and these protests have actually reminded me quite a bit of one of the ways that some of the rappers in Dakar. So my new project is on rappers. They often film their videos and their clips in like big state infrastructures. So on overpasses and that sort of thing. And this is in the context of an environment where things like overpasses are seen as sort of absurd, elitist places to spend money, but as the sort of symbol of the state's negligence, of the state's sort of rejection of a sort of more people's infrastructure, that sort of thing. So they're certainly doing that in those places, and I think there's some sort of a connection here with what we're seeing around the politics of manifestation here. That is, I think, a critique of the big web that constitutes sort of state power in all the ways that it is being seen to be negligent, being seen to be reprehensible in this particular moment. So that's one thought on that. Sure, other people.
And if I could just build on that, really excellent question. I think what I didn't present on today, my previous work has really looked at citizenship, struggles around water access and how water infrastructure is a site for citizenship struggles. But I think in this work as well, sort of the increased flooding in the city has initiated struggles around the right to a safe city. And so, in answer to your question, I think infrastructure lays bare the many ways in which people claim the right to the city. And so even in the most recent protests that we've seen, coming out on bridges and using infrastructure in ingenious ways, I think points at the many different creative, insurgent ways in which people use infrastructure to vocalize claims about the right to the city. But I think that also pushes us as academics and activists to think about, well, what does the right to the city really mean? And how is kind of the material use of infrastructure broadening out our conception of the right to the city? So although I study a very different context, and as you said, it's a very literal connection to infrastructure. It's like water, or it's stormwater infrastructure, and it's for that sake. But still, that is a claim about the right to a safe, equitable city, and its materialities. Whereas in this case, in the examples you just cited, it's infrastructure as a conduit to articulating claims about the right to the city. But I think, as Razi said, in a kind of, these web of connections, to just see these spaces as conduits and as kind of the materiality where this stuff happens is really useful. And yeah, very nice question. Thank you.
Does anyone have anything else on Stuart's question?
Well, the Stewart's question actually reminded me of your book title, and the link between cities, and strategies you might use to shut down a factory, machinery of a factory, and kind of machinery of cities, like the streets. So.
When our book comes out, we have a chapter on it.
Yes.
In fact. Okay, so we'll take some more questions when we come back.
Yeah, hi. I think I have a pretty basic question. I'm interested in any that's open to anyone, definitions of infrastructure. Some of you have used more explicit definitions, others more implicit definitions. And it seems like it's really diverse. There's bodies and trains and stormwater, and then also houses, maybe expanded into lungs. And I'm interested in kind of how you're defining infrastructure and the way that you've used it in your research now, why you made the decision, and what you feel is sort of like the stakes in making that decision about the definition of infrastructure. And if you want to compare it and contrast it to some of your other panelists.
I had a couple of questions actually also. For Rosalind Fredericks, I was wondering if you had any sort of like thoughts on the parallels between Dakar and New York as far as garbage sort of like as something that we deal with on day to day. I couldn't help but notice you mentioned the statue that they're putting up or have put up in Dakar, and that in New York we have some interesting new landmarks that like also point to a certain level of hubris, like the new tallest building on Park Avenue, and as a society, we and a city, we tend to spend a lot of money on very peculiar projects. And at the same time, trash, in New York is sort of like maybe not nearly as modern or as efficient as even other international cities that compare as a first-class city. Never mind sort of the most breakthrough technological advancements like I know they have like vacuum, like trash collection systems and all sorts of things that could redefine how labor is dedicated to that. And also for Detroit, I was wondering, I can't remember if you mentioned this, but if there was actually a demolition method that is completely safe as far as lead removal is concerned, or if that's still actually a mystery, sort of like something we're stuck with. And then also if you had any comment on like, in these cities that are going from housing back to fields, like one of the hot topics is urban farming. And if you're farming on land that is contaminated with lead, that could have some pretty, devastating consequences like down the road. So if you have any comments on that, that would be great.
Great, let's take one last one over here. Thank you all for transporting the mic.
Thanks. I had a question, I guess, that's sort of building on the definitional one. So infrastructure has become kind of a hot topic, at least in urban studies, which is my field. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to think about why and what we're doing with it. And so this is an open-ended question for anyone. I guess I was just wondering if any of you could reflect on its current popularity and what you think that's about and what you think we get from it as scholars, sort of analytically or as a sort of methodological approach, or kind of what you're... And I would also invite Catherine to talk about sweetness, because I'm quite interested.
Sure. Yeah, I know it's me. It's the same person. So you asked a question, Chris, about infrastructure, how people are defining it, and how we came to it as an analytical category. Is that right? Sorry, I don't see myself as an anthropologist of infrastructure. But strangely, I feel pleasantly co-opted by the movement. I guess I turned to questions of housing because I wanted to think about material forms that bring bodies into relation with each other, right? And what intrigued me about where I worked, not in Detroit, but actually in this earlier project on public housing on the west side of Chicago, was that the sort of standard ways of organizing and mobilizing around housing, which have been since the 1960s, arguments about racial discrimination no longer stuck, right? So it didn't actually work in court, which becomes the sort of main place where people actually argue for rights to sound housing. And what intrigued me was that instead of questions about racial discrimination or claims of racial discrimination, which were made in private, which were made, casually, but in formal scenarios, people would make a claim to being harmed by various kinds of infrastructures, right? So I've written a lot about heating infrastructure and building decay, and so these became the things that people were sort of fixating on and organizing around. And so for me, what's intriguing about this concept, if you want to think about it as any kind of form, and it doesn't have to be material, right, but any kind of form that brings 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever entities into relation to each other, is that you're forced to actually move outside of these kinds of very important, but what in some ways, again, I'm not going to say this week, but maybe, so what in some ways are very sort of like stagnant ways of organizing, right? So in this country around class and race, again, like this whole past few weeks throws us out the window, but so I want to think like, are the ways that we have for thinking about social difference in this country, do they need sort of retooling? And looking at something that explicitly asks us to think about the relations between bodies and objects, and the kinds of claims that emerge from that, allow us still to talk about racial discrimination and its effects, but in a different vocabulary that my interlocutors found had much more legal traction. So I think about infrastructure as any kind of entity that brings two or more entities in relation to one another. Why infrastructure? Why now was the question. I just came back from a workshop where this question was posed and like preoccupied us for like 3 days straight, constantly. And there were a number. I'll tell you what people said. There were a number of different things that came up. Someone suggested this has to do with the inability of anthropologists to talk about pure forms of difference, right? This is sort of cynical, answer, right? We can no longer talk about such and such people, but we can talk about objects that might be associated with them. I think that's a cynical read, and I think it's possible, but not entirely fair. Someone else suggested, and I think this is quite interesting, is that it's a moment where people are starting to, where analysts, right, where social scientists, where people in the humanities are trying to think through the magnitude of something like climate change, right? How does one begin to wrap their head around that? And that these kinds of turns to the material, to the infrastructural, etc., are ways to start conceptualizing and conceptually arming ourselves for conceptualizing floods and the Anthropocene and climate change and all these sorts of non-human entities that obviously have human entanglements. I think one thing that's super exciting about it is that it allows for, if we take embodiment seriously and not just a sort of arrangement of bodies, but actually that bodies are formed through their movement in built environments, we can start to begin to talk about something like our co-substantiation with other entities, right? So we all in this country share some kind of radioactive material in our bodies, and a lot of us have lead, right? So how do we begin thinking about the distribution of these entities? So there are more questions, but I'm going to stop there because I know that other people want to get on this.
Thank you. Well, I have a slightly narrower definition of infrastructure. To me, infrastructure is a socio-technical artifact infused with power, and that's something that's involved in the production of differentiated space. And so obviously this comes from a place of my research where I look at large socio-technical systems like water and stormwater, and so that's the definition that I think most resonates with me. But of course there's been post-colonial scholars that have actually talked about people as infrastructure, like Abdulmalik Simon in the case of post-colonial Africa. So I think that people come at it with different lenses and definitions. I mean, I liked what you said about, you know, something that connects 2 points, or something that connects 2 actors, if you can put it that way as well. But I think the socio-technicality of it, or the fact that the social is kind of completely imbricated with the technical in infrastructures, is very core to the way I define it. It's interesting you were asking why infrastructure now, because I feel as if infrastructure was very current when I started my dissertation, you know, several years ago, with the publication of, you know, Graham and Marvin's book, Splintering Urbanism, where it was a very sort of sociological look at infrastructure, but then earlier than that, Susan Leigh Starr's Ethnographies of Infrastructure, right? So it's been a current topic, and I really like the way she puts it. You know, it's these mundane objects that really lay bare power relations, right? And so social scientists who are interested in justice, who are interested, you know, in critically analyzing power relations in history, have to look at these mundane objects, because the more mundane it is, the more we take it for granted, right? So I think it's been a debate for a while, it's been a topic for a while, but for me, the exciting resurgence is really the application of post-colonial theory to infrastructure. And the idea, a critique of Graham and Marvin's book is not that the modern infrastructural ideal, this idea of seamless kind of interconnected systems that prevailed for the 20th century, have fallen apart due to neoliberalism, but rather in the colonial world, post-colonial world, there was never a modern infrastructural ideal, right? Infrastructures were always differentially produced. And so now it's a question how those differential infrastructures articulate with market-based paradigms, right? And there's in the post-colonial world, there's no sense of sort of the formal and the legal and the illegal. It's a spectrum of like informality, right? And so I think post-colonial theory really brings to that conversation something different that wasn't in the kind of earlier discussion of infrastructure. That to me is the most exciting part about the social science, critical social science of infrastructure.
I guess I didn't know that infrastructure was hot, and I don't know if I have a definition. But I know that at least when I started, when I was in graduate school, the thing that people kept the reference was built environment, or the built environment, and I'm not sure what the relationship between infrastructure and the built environment is, but that's kind of what interested me early on, and what interested me was in many ways what Camille said. What? Cassie. Sorry.
It's the Catherine Cassie.
Yeah, Cassie was saying, which was that I was really interested in struggles over objects in the city, and the first thing I got interested in was history of the wheelchair lift on buses, and the struggle of people with disabilities for wheelchair lifts, which was a very kind of infrastructural thing that was central to access in the city. So, but in terms of a definition, I like the ones I've heard.
So I guess I would just build on those comments, especially Malini, the way that you were sort of tracing the sort of genealogy of the concept as it's emerged in urban studies more recently, and just kind of start where you ended at your last point, which is this kind of reclamation of infrastructures by a certain sort of kind of urban post-colonial scholarship. And I think, you know, one of the ways that this particular literature has sort of reclaimed infrastructure, or critiqued the kind of splintering infrastructure, networked infrastructure idea, has been through very much forwarding this notion of sort of people as infrastructure, right? Like in the non-networked South, in the informal South, there are other kinds of infrastructure. And I think part of the power of that process of reclamation was to sort of name something that wasn't being considered sort of solid enough, right? It was a way of kind of giving the informal the power of infrastructure, this big sort of, you know, word that we associate with, you know, big scale modernizing projects, et cetera. And so I think that move made by Abdul-Malik Simone and others to sort of call it infrastructure, even if it's informal, even if it's people-based, even if it's labor-intensive, was aimed at, you know, sort of resisting the sort of idea of the absence of infrastructure, or the absence of institutions even in the global South, et cetera. But I think my take on that is a little bit sort of different, and I'm definitely working with the idea of people as infrastructure, and have been, you know, very sort of formed, I guess, and informed and inspired to some degree by ideas like Simone's and others. But I think part of the problem with that is that it's too optimistic, and it has this sort of notion of sort of blindly giving structure to something without thinking about what structures that structure, how you can actually define that structure. And so that's where I then, and this is kind of in the definitional answer, have turned to what I think has been a really generative scholarship coming from sort of STS-inspired literature that's thinking about the materiality of infrastructure and saying we have to pick apart even that black box of people as infrastructure and say, how are these so-called structures material, and what can we learn from that? And I think what that does, obviously, as you saw in my paper, in terms of the arts of infrastructure, the people as infrastructure argument, is to say this isn't always good, right? This isn't always positive. It isn't always something that we need to celebrate. People as infrastructure can be a profoundly sort of burdensome state for a city, for urban practice, et cetera. But you also miss, there still is this bifurcation between the sort of social and the built environment, right? And I think Abdulmalik Simone, in a way, goes so far into saying that people are infrastructure that he sort of forgets the built environment, and he wants so much to claim that these social groupings that are making the city are an infrastructure, are an architecture, that he's sort of actually missing the interlinkages between the built and the social. And that's what I get from the kind of social science, the STS inspiration there, is in really thinking about the imbrication. And that's why I'm so interested in this question of the ways that people and their machines and their infrastructures and their overpasses literally conform to each other in the ways that you get sort of different forms of agency beyond people. You get this sort of non-human forms of agency that really resist the separation between the built and the social, the built city and the kind of social city. And then that just to kind of get to your question, I think is one of the ways that I think about something like a comparison between Dakar and New York. And I think infrastructure helps you get there if you're thinking in these broad terms, where infrastructure can be an assemblage, an ecology that is both the built and the social and the bodies and the affective and the discursive and the cosmological, as I'm sort of pointing out there, is that you can look at that in all these different settings without getting this pejorative global south infrastructure versus global north, et cetera. And I think a lot about trash infrastructures in New York. I'm actually teaching a class, a couple of people are in it here, about trash in general around the globe. And we've been reading a lot about New York, and it was the first time that I had actually ever read a lot of this stuff and learned that, the city of New York, to a degree that I had never imagined, was built literally on trash, et cetera. And I think, going back to sort of the power of this definition, I think a sort of broader understanding of infrastructure can help us make these helpful comparisons that I think are so crucial to a sort of new urban studies that resist this sort of southern versus northern distinction. And you can raise all of these sorts of really provocative questions about what we see in these forms of imbrication as they take place in these different sectors of the globe, but have all this stuff in common. And of course, you may know, if you've read about trash in New York, there's this book that our colleague Robin Nagel just put out called Picking Up, which is about the trash workers of New York. And she's really, I think she's, not necessarily working exactly with the same definition of infrastructure that we're getting at, but I do think that she goes pretty far in looking at the ways that the municipal workers, sanitary workers are rendered invisible, are a sort of invisible, illegible infrastructure, et cetera, that is actually very comparable to Dakar in all sorts of interesting and juicy ways. So I think a lot about that comparison, and I have a lot more to say about that, but great question.
Before we take more questions, Cassie, do you have an answer for are there other ways to remediate lead?
Yeah, the way that people would like to do is through, which is what interests you, is through a process called building deconstruction. It's not Deridian, it's just actually like picking apart the building from top to bottom to reuse most of the materials that can be salvaged. And what's attractive about it is that it actually requires quite a skilled labor force, which is how I actually got interested in this. The thought here is that a quite eager labor force would be sort of like the army of ex-felons, right, who live in these cities and who are kind of shut out because of their records or because of sort of the ethnic or racial exclusions of the unions into building practices. So, it's potentially an area, it's kind of waste processing. So that's the thought, you would sort of take it apart piece by piece, so you're not kicking up the kind of dust that's required. Municipalities don't want to spend the money on it because it is more expensive. So it's probably going to emerge in some place like Detroit as a kind of hybrid that they're calling skimming. So like the language of extraction is actually really interesting here because these are materials that have already been extracted once through the kind of moment of settler colonialism felling these forests. But it's called skimming, so you would do a kind of pick out the obvious materials that might have some value, like banisters and floors, or sort of big interior beams, bricks. There's a huge market in bricks in sort of Chicago and Detroit bricks that go to Arizona and all sorts of stuff. And then you would throw a wrecking ball or a claw at it with water. So you kind of get the kind of cost effectiveness, but you put some people to work and you salvage some materials. So that's the thought. And you asked about the gardening. Yeah, I am surprised at this as well. I've heard people say some very shocking things, like, I know there's lead in this soil, but it's better to eat this zucchini than a bag of potato chips, which I normally have for lunch. So I don't know what to make of that. It's not something I focused on, but I know I found it alarming, and this was said more than several times. So it's kind of like risk with even like what you're choosing to put in your body, but I mean, there's a widespread awareness of lead. So this is kind of, a joke, but not a joke that people kind of speculated around.
We have time for a few more questions in the back. Yeah. Do you want is that Daniel? Oh.
Thanks. I'll stand since I'm so far back. Yeah, I have a question about the metaphors. And I'm thinking, on the one hand, people are talking about the importance of making infrastructure visible. And it reminds me of the idea of the Enlightenment, bringing things to light. And think about this great quote that I found on my phone, not that I've memorized, where Michel Roth-Trouillot, the anthropologist, says the ultimate mark of power is invisibility, the ultimate challenge is the exposure of its roots. I feel that is an idea where you make something visible as a form of debunking. But my feeling when I read a lot of the work on infrastructure and in this panel today, all these great arguments, it seems they're not so much like debunking power relations so much as like rebunking them and showing that in some ways these forms of power are far more obstinate or ubiquitous than one might have realized, to the point that we even ascribe agency to them. And so if that's true, I wonder, does the metaphor of illumination actually work anymore? Does it still make sense? Does the kind of moral charge that it carries, is that really consistent with the arguments being made? And if not, then do we need to think about other metaphors for knowledge and discovery? So grad student question.
Hello. Okay. My question is related to the context of New York, and also is kind of about the political processes and the political tools we can use to build better infrastructure, or infrastructure that's more attentive to perhaps like traditionally marginalized populations. And I think right now is an interesting time to be asking that in New York City because of the mayor's agenda to create so many new units of affordable housing that will, perhaps create housing opportunities for people who didn't have those types of opportunities before, but will also fundamentally reorganize neighborhoods and change space or spatial infrastructures in new ways. And I'm sure that neighborhoods and people might kind of, like people in neighborhoods or just urban residents are always reacting to infrastructures that are imposed by political bodies. So I'm wondering, should politicians pay more attention to what's happening in between the spaces of more formal infrastructure, or or when you're creating infrastructure for those who might potentially traditionally be marginalized, how do you account for existing infrastructures? I don't know if that's a well-formed enough question, but that's the direction I'm going. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, just one more. I think we have time for, and then you guys can each take like a couple minutes to respond and wrap up.
Well, thank you for these wonderful presentations. Actually, it was super generative, and and actually a lot of points of congruence, and some interesting divergences too. But I wanted to ask a question about the political stakes, methodologically, and political stakes writ large for everybody. So the more STS question I had during the presentation was that I was wondering if in your field sites, what would be examples of infrastructure's agency resisting enrollment in some of these dominant projects? Because I heard reference to neoliberalism, colonialism, racism, capitalism. These are all projects that bring together heterogeneous elements also, and infrastructure is physical, it's unbending, and there must be times in which it doesn't go along with that. And dominant projects, or whatever it may be in the particular case, must be affected in some way if the agency and the materiality argument holds. And my question for Kafui, who actually incidentally had one of the most very clearly materialist physical argument, which was the human body's limit. But I had a question about the political stakes for you, which is, this must come through in the discussions within unions about transportation, the old community labor divide. There must be arguments made sometimes that a speed up must be good for residents who have greater mobility and cheaper bus fares, and breaking units must be better. You hear these kinds of arguments in lots of contexts, but I wonder how it comes up in your research and what responses are.
Okay, so everyone, you guys can each take a couple minutes, and then we'll wrap up with that. So thanks. Maybe reverse this way. Kathy, do you want to start? And go around.
Okay, I can go to John Paulo's question about community labor alliances and tensions. I think that you're right, it is a tension. Oftentimes, I think that one of the examples I used was one person in a wheelchair or one person who's asking for directions can mean you lose your bathroom break, for example. So yes, that is a problem, and I think the role that the strategy that the ATU 192 local has used is been the Enlightenment Project. It's been about making bladders visible to the public, and people's ability and drivers' need to pee visible. And so some of that comes in performances like by Titus Warren. In that same meeting, they had a bedpan, or like a little trough to be in. So it's a lot of theatrics around showing the need for people to pee. But yeah, it's not the only tension between drivers and the community, but it is one that they're trying to address by making it visible and asking for more money for transit, which would allow more buses, which would mean more recovery time and more spot time.
Do you want to speak to any of the other?
No.
Well, there's a lot there. I mean, these have been incredibly rich questions. I mean, on the question of sort of, is this rebunking infrastructures, and there's sort of there's sort of a flavor of like the bunker almost in your question there, and I think I think that I would sort of disagree. I certainly we shouldn't get overly obsessed with certain concepts to at the expense of other important, devices for thinking through important things. But I do think that one of the sort of benefits or one of the promises of this new sort of widened understanding of infrastructure is that it isn't just about hardening, right? It's about sort of bringing in all of the soft tissue pieces that are both bodies and communities and all of the dust that you can't even sort of imagine is part of an infrastructure into the purview of what we're thinking about and considering. And a number of the panelists actually spoke of a sort of a different kind of temporal understanding of infrastructure that I think is part of this broadening, this sort of widening of the purview that I'm referring to. And I think that's one way of sort of resisting the bunker or not rebunking infrastructures is, really broadening out how we're thinking about them, how we're thinking about the longevity, the history, the sort of origins of where these things came from and where they're going and how we're interacting with them. And then to the question of sort of how to build more equitable infrastructures, I would sort of connect the previous to this comment and just say that I think you pointed out a number of I think you answered your question in a lot of ways, in the sense that I think what scholars of more sort of just infrastructures are saying is necessary is this, is paying attention to the space in between, is paying attention to the soft tissue, to the junctures, to the ligaments, to the people and the ideas and the dreams that are embodied in infrastructure. And I guess I would just add to that a little bit more attention to the latter, which is, how do people value their infrastructure and how that becomes important as city planners think about what to build and why they're going to build it is the obvious question of thinking about what those buildings might mean to actual human bodies as they interact with them, but also to our hopes and dreams as urban citizens who are looking for certain kinds of cities. And then to John Paolo's question, I think this is a really provocative sort of way to think about the agency, and I know a lot of people have issues with sort of ascribing that word to non-human actants, but is this question of sort of what, in what ways don't infrastructures sort of comply with these insurgent projects, for instance? And I think that the answer is exactly sort of about the ways that these non-human actants do act, right? They act all the time, whether it's from the garbage trucks that I look at that are confounding the hackers, the bricoleurs every day who may have, practiced their art, but then get a limb torn off because the truck just acted a different way one day, or the water meters that Antina von Schnitzler talks about in sort of insurgent politics around privatized water in South Africa that sort of sometimes work, sometimes don't in that political project. I think there's a sort of host of there's unlimited sort of set of examples there, but the way you can sort of get at them is through thinking about this sort of non-human agency and the way that these structures can conform to us. We can conform to them, but only to a certain degree. And what we have to look at is where that disconnect takes place.
Well, first to the excellent grad student type question, which are always the first and best question. I actually thought you made a really important point, which is this idea that infrastructure is invisible, does it really hold? And what we're doing is sort of really rendering visible and illuminating. Is that really a good metaphor? And I agree with your provocation. I think Colin McFarland has said that this whole idea that infrastructure is invisible really only holds for Euro-American context, because they're so in your face everywhere. You're tripping over, if you live in a slum, you're living right on the sewage pipeline. You could be tripping over wires. They're so in your face. They're so above ground. They're not concealed in hidden networks, right? They're really in your face. So therefore, what are we making visible if they're actually really visible? So I actually really like the metaphor of disruption in the sense that infrastructures are disruptive, but also we're trying to disrupt the canon of urban theory that we've tried to, that we've accepted over 50 years from the birth of the sort of the field. And so disruption to me is a useful intellectual and material way to think about infrastructure. To get at your question, I actually think it's a very valid question. And so I have a forthcoming paper. And I think this really gets at the post-colonial urbanism that Rosie was laying out earlier. How do we actually disrupt these boundaries between the global north and south and bring ideas of infrastructure, the politics of infrastructure, and the assemblages that constitute infrastructure to bear on the global north, where we seem to have sort of forgotten that infrastructure has so much power. So I have a forthcoming paper comparing water marginalization in the global north and global south, looking at the case of the Central Valley in California, where people live in global south-like conditions, right? And so here you're really disrupting the idea that people in the global north have water access, right? In fact, there are many places that don't. And so how do we actually use ideas of urban informality developed very richly in the global south to understanding these third world contexts in the global north? That is a disruptive intellectual practice. That is a subversive intellectual practice. That is the kind of work that I really like to do, and I'm starting to do right now. And I think that gets really nicely to your question of New York City. New York City has a lot of places that don't conform to this global infrastructural ideal, or the modern infrastructural ideal. And I think the fact that New York City, suffered so badly in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy means that it is not immune to disruption, right? And that is, again, the kind of post-colonial theory, traveling theory, I think, that makes it such a rich case. And so I think you actually put it very nicely. Should politicians pay attention to the interstitial spaces, the spaces in between, the spaces that don't conform to how we think about infrastructure? And I absolutely think so. And I think the more that we're facing this kind of world in which environmental change is affecting infrastructure, the more we'll start to break down the barriers between the north and the south. Climate change is going to do that, And finally, your question about the agency of infrastructure and resisting enrollment. I mean, absolutely, that was what I was trying to get at with the political stakes are that actually it floods. Infrastructure is not easily amenable to being used, in my case, the stormwater infrastructure, to being used as just pure sanitation lines, because when you start doing that, you're actually worsening the flood risk of the city. And so, one fine day, it literally explodes, right? They're layered with sewage infrastructure, and when it rains, it just the whole thing just comes up. So there's this, it's very, again, visceral. You can actually see the agency in action. I mean, and it's like pushed to a sort of limit, and then it floods. And similarly, when you're commodifying wetlands, you're asking for trouble, because infrastructure is not, that kind of infrastructure, wetland infrastructure, is not very easily enrolled and subdued by capital, because it has this sort of potency that comes out. And of course, just to kind of qualify the idea of non-human agency, there is no non-human agency without, in some senses, the human agency that it's kind of very mutually enrolled and imbricated. And so I think the critical and sophisticated theorizing around that really thinks about both of these things in conjunction, and not kind of simplified, like environmentally deterministic, like, oh, it rains and we flood. It's more like it rains, and that interacts with all these systems that we set in place that then has this kind of energy of its own, right? I think that kind of theorizing is really exciting, it's really material, and it's historic as well.
Concept metaphors, I mean, we all need them, or we all use them, and we all get constrained by them as well, right? So they're they open up possibilities, but they also, they're treacherous, and that they constrain us into a certain way of thought. I'm not particularly wedded to this idea of visibility. I think it leaves out so much of the ways that our built environments, and that's the term that I prefer to use, shape or make certain kinds of tastes or possibilities possible or impossible, right? So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, the easy way out of it would just to say, the question is not so much what's visible or invisible, but rather on what terms does it emerge as an object of collective attention, right? Of collective visibility, if you will, right? So that is like, so yeah, I mean, there are many things we don't notice in our cities where things are functioning properly. In many places where I've worked, I guess in the global north, things don't work properly at all, and they're quite noticeable. So this divide is really confusing to me. But I mean, again, my push is always to think about in what terms is it possible for something like your pipe or your burn from a pipe or an elevator to become a site of intense organizing and litigation, right? So those are more interesting to me than rather not like we've ignored these and let's make them visible. It's rather to ask on what terms in these life worlds do these objects become visible or interesting. So in that respect, organizing around a highway or a protest against racism that centers on a highway is really interesting, right? On what terms? New York, more attentive to people. How do we count? So I think I have sketchy notes on this, but how can we build better infrastructures in New York? Was that the question? I don't unfortunately do any practical work, so I can't really answer that question. But I have a lot of suggestions, right? So sometimes. Where I've worked in public housing in Chicago, there are some very straightforward things that are design issues that could have easily been assessed if someone had taken the time to ask these very mundane questions. Where do people hang up clothes? How thick are the walls that contain noise? Right? Are there any sort of front spaces versus back spaces? These sound like very mundane things, but these are the very issues that in the transformation from high-rise to sort of more scattered site public housing, people are losing their leases over, right? Because they prefer to be out front, because noise travels differently through drywall than it did through concrete, right? Because concrete retains heat in a way that drywall won't, right? So these are very small, minor things that could have a very smart urban designer could have found their way around without. And the result of not asking these questions means that some of my interlocutors have burned down their houses on accident or lost their leases. So they're really important but small, mundane things that end up being sort of quality of life pivots that then evict families from public housing. So yeah, absolutely, I would love for that to be a kind of. I do have ideas about this. It should be a sort of part of the curriculum of urban planners, right? To sort of take a course that asks them to think about how to talk to a range of people and listen for a range of desires and stuff like that. So apparently I have ideas about that. The political stakes methodologically, infrastructure is resisting enrollment. I don't really like thinking about this idea of like matter that resists human action, right? I sort of think, so we have sort of human action or intention or design, and then we have matter that can then push back in unexpected ways or unintended consequences. I want to think more about the co-constitution of the world of humans and what are not humans.
I was resisting a little bit the black boxing of capitalism and neoliberalism.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Not so much the non-human.
Non-human, okay. So the political stakes?
Yeah.
The political stakes are huge, right, to asking these questions. In Detroit, it's the question about whether or not people are going to be, if you do believe this connection between neurological, decay and ingestion of lead, it's whether or not, you have people that can have sound lives. So there are really, I think, interesting stakes to asking questions that poke at this nature-culture divide, right? And just don't reiterate it, but really take it apart and think about the distribution of well-being. Why is it that so many of my interlocutors in Chicago are dying 30 years before other people are, right? These are of diseases that I don't quite understand, right? And that they don't quite understand. So there are really important things that we get at when we talk about infrastructure of the built environment. We open up questions about precisely certain kinds of toxicities, certain kinds of questions about obesity that I think need to be on the table and not left to the scientists who think about genetic rootedness, right? So that would be my push here, to really piece apart this nature-culture divide, not to reinscribe a notion of racial difference, but to really think about how capitalism distributes well-being on very uneven terms, right? Such that some people will die 20, 30 years earlier than other folks in our city, in this city, right? So those, I think, are the stakes, and I think they're huge and worth attending to.
Great way to end. Thank you all very much, and thanks all for coming out tonight.